Artist, painter, modernist, impressionist, innovator, philosopher, son of a preacher man. A Southern soul searching for freedom of expression. A man waging war with his own mind and the voices he was unable to escape. World-renowned abstract expressionist and the struggle to illustrate the light. Beauford Delaney.
The time of Beauford Delaney's birth was Knoxville's high point in many ways. It was really a booming city, a crowded industrial city with a lot going on, and blacks and whites lived close together downtown. It was segregated, but actually not as segregated as it was later on. There was a very healthy black middle class in Knoxville, a professional middle class. But Knoxville really was a lively urban place. There were vaudeville shows all the time, so there were lectures all the time. There were things for the black and the white communities both, and some things they attended together, even though the theaters were segregated. He would have seen some of the first movies shown in Knoxville. In fact, one of the very first movie theaters was owned by Cal Johnson. It was a black-owned movie theater down on Central Street, not just down the hill from his house. The Delaney home was on East Vine Street. Vine Avenue was kind of the spine of the black community and was a place for barber shops and pawn shops and a movie theater or two and lots of activity going on there. Black hotels and doctor's offices and all these things. The area is almost completely wiped out, changed by urban renewal.
Beauford's early life in Knoxville was centered around his father, who was a preacher in Knoxville and an itinerant preacher who carried his gospel to various churches around the area. So he grew up in a family that was very spiritual, but he was also very much influenced by his mother, who was, although not literate, was very dignified, was very concerned with his living a life which she could be proud of. At a very early age, he became interested in sketching and painting, and his mother encouraged him in that.
Beauford, just like so many other African-American families, would have been very closely connected and tied to his family. You certainly can't talk about him without talking about Joseph, and even his own brother Joseph talked about his relationship to his brother was always with respect to that family dynamics, that basis of the faith. While Joseph, who went on to become an extraordinary artist in his own right, they were completely different from one another. One was an introvert, one was an extrovert, but the thing they had in common was this whole idea of their Christian upbringing. Sunday was a sacred day, right? It was a holy day, and never mind Wednesday was prayer meeting night. So I think when you look at their life, you have to look at from the foundation of where they came from, that strong family connection.
He got a job in a shoe shine shop, and while he was waiting between customers, he did some sketches, and the owner of the shop showed the sketch to a friend who was Lloyd Branson, who eventually hired Beauford to work in his studio.
I think one of the key early influences for Beauford was his experience helping Lloyd Branson, who was a master artist, someone who painted many portraits of prominent individuals. He did history paintings, landscapes. And so Beauford had a chance to work in the studio with Branson to see how he managed his practice. I think one of the key lessons that he learned was that Branson felt as if all art should be somehow attached to depicting light, the theme of light, and that's something that Beauford never forgot. Now, the way that he explored that theme of light was very different from Branson, an individual to Beauford, but that idea was planted in Knoxville at a very early age by Lloyd Branson.
You can't think of the relationship as a kind of father-son relationship. It wasn't that kind of closeness. It was the kind of closeness that might come when a white painter, who is himself a racist essentially, is surprised that this black boy could be a decent painter. He was impressed, to do him credit. He was able to put aside his racial prejudice and see that this was a young man with potential.
August 1919, Red Summer arrives in Knoxville. Riots break out when Maurice Mays, a young black man, is accused of murdering a white woman in her home. The would-be lynch mob, unable to locate the accused, looted downtown businesses of weapons and rampaged through the streets of Knoxville. It's unknown exactly how many black residents were killed, and numerous families fled the city in the aftermath.
I think the riots really frightened him and left an image on his mind that he never lost. That day, he was downtown working at Lloyd Branson's, and he was caught in the riot in the sense that he had to get across the line between the black world and the white world in order to get back home. This whole situation brought to the forefront of his mind the real clash between blacks and whites and the real importance of racism to his development as a person.
I think one of the things that is important to point out in his story is that the Knoxville race riots of 1919 did have an effect on him and intensified his interest in maybe moving somewhere where he felt as if he could have access to a full and complete life and career in the most nurturing atmosphere possible.
With support from Lloyd Branson, Hugh Tyler, and the prominent African-American educator Charles W. Kanzler, Beauford was encouraged to make the move to Boston, Massachusetts, to pursue a formal education in the arts.
When he went to Boston, he was there from 1923 to 1929. He was still a student in many ways. He was formally studying, taking courses where he would do figure drawing and other kinds of things. But he was also studying by going to the museums, and that's something he never stopped doing throughout his life.
It was difficult for him to become a formal member of an art school because art schools were very conservative, and he didn't have the formal credentials to enter an art school. But through his friends, he was able to get into classes. The big problem, interestingly enough, was the life studies classes because of the whole sexual mythology that surrounds black and white relations. The idea of a black man looking at a naked white woman, even in a life study class, was just anathema to many people. As it turned out, Beauford wasn't very interested in looking at naked women anyway, even as a painter. He was very modest, not interested in revealing his own sexuality.
Boston city directories give a small glimpse into where Beauford lived and how he made ends meet, while continuing to study and hone his creative skills.
One thing he began doing in Boston regularly was to go out onto the street and to sketch people. He became a person who said, I can do your portrait in 15 minutes. And he began doing these informal portraits. And this was something that Beauford was always interested in. Beauford was a person. If portraits were a kind of visual psychoanalysis, his paintings were a kind of visual depiction of human nature or the human condition. He traveled in a pretty fancy world in Boston. But it's interesting, too, that once he saw that he had learned what he could learn there, he followed the advice of those very people who said, you know, Beauford, if you really want to be a painter, you probably have to go to New York.
In 1929, Beauford left Boston for New York City, arriving at the end of the Harlem Renaissance and at the beginning of the Great Depression.
He went up to Harlem immediately with the few dollars he had and with his portfolio of portraits. And he rented an apartment, left everything there, and paid for 2 weeks' rent, and then went to explore the city. 2 hours later, he came back, and the woman he had rented the apartment from said she didn't know who he was, didn't know anything about him, and told him to get out. All of his possessions and 2 weeks' rent money were taken, and he was out on the street. He went down to Greenwich Village. He essentially slept on a park bench for the first night. While he was asleep, someone stole his shoes. So it was a sad beginning. But he managed, through people he knew by connections, to be saved. He found himself attracted to Greenwich Village, partly because he didn't want to be known as a Negro painter, he wanted to be known as a painter. And eventually he became a kind of notorious figure in Greenwich Village because there weren't a lot of black people living in Greenwich Village, not a lot of black painters living in Greenwich Village. Most lived up in Harlem. And he met a lot of young painters like Romar Bearden, for example. He was associated with Palmer Hayden, with lots of well-known black painters, especially in the WPA period. And Beauford did WPA work.
It wasn't long after Beauford's arrival in New York that we began to see his first mention in the press. One of the 4 Sunday painters, having only 1 day in 7 to give to their art, whose work was shown at the Whitney Studio Galleries, February 26 to March 8, is Beauford Delaney, who supports himself by working as a hotel bellboy. The Herald Tribune art critic speaks of the unaffected simplicity and sincerity of purpose of Mr. Delaney's pastel portraits. The World art critic of his portraiture, which he does well both in oils and pastels. Mr. Delaney studied in Boston at the South Boston School of Art and at the Copley Society, and is interested particularly in portraiture.
Beauford's early work, you see his strong academic foundation. Beauford took a lot of their lessons and ended up, for instance, creating portraits of friends and family where you begin to see the use of color in ways that is expressive and departs from nature, where he would find all kinds of radical color combinations that make the portrait as much about the color as it is about this representation of an individual sitting in the artist's studio. From there, he continues his interest in portraits, but by the time he gets to New York, he's a mature artist, he's exploring abstraction, he's doing his own thing, getting a notice for what he's doing.
There were 3 kinds of paintings he did. One was portraiture, one was absolute abstractions, the other was representational painting with abstract elements. He continued doing all 3 of those all through his life. For instance, in portrait painting, he learned from some of the things that John Singer Sargent had started to do. Put less emphasis on the outlines of a face, for example, and more emphasis on what light could do to create an outline, rather than to have a delineated face. And the same thing applied to paintings he did. He did lots of paintings of the world around him. So he painted pictures of men standing around fires in a garbage can, of street corners, or of people in little nightclubs in Greenwich Village, of jazz musicians. Beauford took all of this and turned it into a picture of life. Portraits of existence, portraits of beauty.
What he begins to do is to take scenes of the city and turn them into what almost appears to be mosaics of painted color. Life as he saw it became reduced and simplified in these vibrant compositions that were really sophisticated. He becomes part of this new interest in mid-century modernism, abstraction, where you're taking real life, but you're synthesizing it and simplifying it according to your own vision. He explored so many different realms of art and of expression. In terms of subject matter, eventually you see him developing to the point where references to the visible world are dissolved by his interest in exploring brilliant color. And it's again the artist paying attention to what's happening internally and looking at, okay, it's not so much me describing the world around me, it's me describing my reaction to what I see and changing emotions and exploring the ideas of what color means in its pure state.
He also was noticed by important people like Stieglitz, like people at the old Whitney Museum downtown. He was given the opportunity to participate in group shows. Unfortunately, most of the group shows were listed as group Negro shows, and he did participate in those. Eventually, with the help of Stieglitz and Georgia O'Keeffe and others, he was able to have shows of his own and to show paintings at the Whitney, and he became recognized.
Georgia O'Keeffe is known for her paintings of New Mexico and still lifes with stones and shells and everyday objects that she raises to a monumental level of simplicity and color. She did very few portraits. She did portraits, as far as my research goes, of two individuals. One was a family member, the other was Beauford Delaney. And she didn't do just one of Beauford, she did 3 portraits of Beauford.
Henry Miller took an immediate liking to Beauford. And in fact, he even wrote a chapbook about Beauford, which really helped to make Beauford better known.
He was, by 1938, included in national magazines. They would do a survey of influential African Americans in the arts, and there was a photograph of him at Washington Square Park showing his work. Some have said that the reason for his interest in light also had to do with the fact that friends, family members talk about him battling some sort of inner darkness, voices that he heard that brought him down. He had to fight against them. He saw light in other people, and in many cases I think that's why the portraits look the way they do, is that he was tuning into the light that he saw inside people. If you've got these great friends who are all connected and full of positive energy and love you and love your work, that's going to help pull you out of that and get you back on the right track.
I suppose the best known person he met was James Baldwin. Baldwin was 15. He was going through a real emotional crisis. He was gay and sort of figuring that out. He was encouraged in his difficult time to go down to Greenwich Village and to talk to this notorious painter, Beauford Delaney, who might be able to help him. So he did. He went and he knocked on the door. Beauford opened the door. Essentially, that began what was the deepest friendship in both of their lives. I should say at the outset, it was not a sexual friendship, even though both were gay. They had a lot in common. Both were gay, both were preachers' sons, both were committed to the arts.
Beauford Delaney had also cultivated a close friendship with the Harlem Renaissance intellectual, writer, and poet, Countee Cullen. Countee and Beauford would often meet up at 306 West 141st Street, a popular gathering place for black artists and intellectuals, such as Jacob Lawrence and Langston Hughes.
Countee Cullen talked to Beauford a lot about Paris, about how someday he should go to Paris. We've got to remember that Paris, for African Americans at the time, and in a way even still, is a kind of mythical land. Paris was the place where African Americans could go and could be accepted. Beauford's trip to France, his first trip to Europe, on the Liberté, was one of the happiest occasions of his life.
One of the first deep impressions of France on me was the clear sort of strained light of Normandy, as we rolled along slowly through the farmland, where occasionally one saw several horses being led away from the fields by a young man or woman, amid delight, which included everything, the train as well. It all became one picture. The light, inscrutable, eternal, serene, wordless yet sovereign, moving yet still, including all things, silencing all things.
Ships came in at that time in Le Havre, which is on the sort of the northwest coast of France, and then you took a train into Paris, and all the trains came into the Saint-Lazare station, the Gare Saint-Lazare. On that voyage, he happened to meet a fellow artist named Herb Gentry, and they knew each other from New York. Beauford was just a little bit confused. He often got confused when he traveled, and 2 African-American men joined by Herb Gentry, and they all took him into the city and got his first hotel room for him in the Montparnasse area. And this is where artists had been living and working for decades at that point. And so that was how he became introduced to Montparnasse, and that's where he would live the vast majority of his years in Paris. He immediately became immersed in art because artists were everywhere in this area of Paris. And in the first day that he was able to, get up and walk around, he went to a cafe. Cafe life is sort of legendary in Paris, and artists and writers particularly hung out in cafes. And he went to a cafe called the Dome, and he was greeted by many artists that he knew from New York. No idea, this is just total happenstance. This American art community was already there. They introduced him to people that they knew, places where he could show his work and people who would be interested potentially in purchasing his work. And so he was just sort of plopped right down into the middle of the artist's haven.
He talks about how France, and especially Paris from the beginning, captured him. The light, the feeling on the street, the freedom to go and be what he wanted to do. 1 week led to another, and before you knew it, it was 1 year led to another. And in fact, Beauford only came home once in the late 60s. He came home to Knoxville for a very brief time and then went back to Paris and never left again.
As the years went on, Beauford became increasingly mentally fragile. He had physical illnesses and he had mental/psychological illnesses. He just went into a decline. He had kidney problems, he had liver problems, neither of which was helped by alcohol consumption. He had always had these psychological problems, even as a child. We don't know exactly what they were. So he had a real mental breakdown. He actually tried to commit suicide in 1960.
He'd always wanted to go to Greece to see the ruins of ancient Greece. He had a show of his paintings, which went quite well, actually. And soon after that, he had a little bit of money. He took the train from Paris to Brindisi, I guess is where he got the ferry. And the voices began saying, you don't need this money, you don't need this food, give it away, because you're not going to need it. And he started giving away money and food on the train to people. And the voices still wouldn't let him go, even after he did this. He got to Brindisi, the voices followed him when he got onto the ferry boat that was going to take him to Patras in Greece. He got on the boat. As long as he drank, the voices stayed away, sort of. They got almost to Greece, and the voices just tortured him. And then he went over to the starboard side, and he jumped into the water with the intention of drowning. He didn't know how to swim. A fisherman plucked him out of the water, and he went to a hospital in Athens until somebody came and got him and brought him back to Paris.
His affairs were more and more taken on by his friends. They tried to manage his money, and they tried to make sure that he always went to his doctor's appointments, and even his doctors became his friends. People really loved him, and they really were trying to look out for him to the best of their ability without really trying to encroach upon his independence.
In terms of his bringing Knoxville with him, whenever he had a crisis, a mental crisis, his journals indicate that his thoughts went back to home and to some of that spiritual life. Why else would you write down the words of old songs, old church songs?
But there came a time when one day he just disappeared. It took days for them to find him. When they found him, he really didn't know who he was. He was very incoherent. So he was admitted to St. Anne's Hospital, which is a hospital for psychiatric patients. And that's where he lived the last 4 years of his life. Any and everything that he had, he threw into his art. And he inspired people by that example. So the life that he led, even though it was fraught with problems, still he was a very single-minded man in the sense that he knew he was made to create art. And that's what he spent as much time as possible doing and becoming better just by virtue of all of these things. And so his life was an example to people in that way. So when he died at St. Anne's Hospital, He was buried in a cemetery outside of Paris, and he was buried in a pauper's grave. Me and a few friends of Beauford were able to place a tombstone at Beauford's previously unmarked grave. We picked out a stone together, and they told me what they wanted inscribed on it. And one of the friends sent me a photograph of him. And then I founded an organization in France called Les Amis de Beauford Delaney, which means Friends of Beauford Delaney, to raise the money for the stone. Where he lived, there are lots of plaques that honor artists in Montparnasse. And I said to myself, well, one way I can honor him is to get a plaque put up, on one of the buildings that was important to him. But we ended up with 2 plaques honoring Beauford.
The darkness of Beauford's beginnings in Tennessee many years ago was a black blue midnight indeed, opaque and full of sorrow. And I do not know, nor will any of us ever really know, what kind of strength it was that enabled him to make so dogged and splendid a journey. James Baldwin.
Funding support provided by the Robert and Tony Bader Charitable Foundation and from viewers like you. Thank you.